over the last several years, we've seen that public colleges and universities are receiving less money from states. So just want to get your sense of what's the implication of this on students, on institutions, and on states generally.
The implications are dramatic, and most of them are negative. And frankly, what it means is that students now bear a greater proportion of the total costs of their education. You know, when I was in school, when you look at the amount of funding that the school got from the state, it probably covered 2/3 of the cost of educating me, and my tuition covered the other third. Now it's completely flipped. Here in Colorado, students are now covering 2/3 or more of the cost of the education, and the state's putting in just less money. We're simply investing less money in each student. So students have to pay more, which means some students just aren't going to have access. Kids who should be going to college won't go because of the cost, and those who do will come out with a lot more debt, and they'll be forced to take certain kinds of jobs. We'll see loan default rates go up, and then finally for institutions, they have to find ways to cut costs, and sometimes that can impact quality.
So we had a great discussion about kind of the process then of getting these students through the pipeline of K-12 college and into the workforce ultimately. So what are some of the most effective policies and programs that you're doing here in Colorado to support this pipeline?
That's a really good question, because what we have to do is make it easier to transition from one system to the next, to move successfully from high school into a community college if that's where a student chooses to go, and from there into a four-year institution if the student wants to pursue a bachelor's degree. And right now we don't have great alignment, and no state really does. So we're focused on making sure that high school graduation requirements actually align with college admission requirements, and that college admission requirements align with the state's remedial policy. So for example, a university might admit a student who meets that institution's admission requirements, but then tests into a remedial course which that institution can't offer. So the student who's been accepted at a university has to return to a community college to get the remedial coursework, notwithstanding the fact that they met the admission requirements. There's just too many disconnects, and what we need to do is make those transitions smoother and easier so students aren't losing time, aren't getting frustrated, and aren't leaving without a credential.
So definitely raised some great points about the importance for students. Why is this important for Colorado and for states generally to smooth this pathway?
Well, because ultimately what we want are more students to be successful. There's more students to be successful. If students are successful and graduate, they can be contributing members of our workforce and our communities. If they don't graduate, they're more likely to cost us money than to generate new revenues. So, especially if we look at the changing nature of jobs, we know in Colorado that the jobs that are going to be created here over the next 10 years are going to be overwhelmingly jobs that require a post-secondary credential. We're not producing nearly enough credentials, enough students to fill those jobs, so it will slow our economy. And we have an aging workforce. When we look at the people who are leaving the workforce and moving into retirement, we need younger workers coming in to fill those jobs and the new jobs that will be created. And we're just not doing a very good job of that.
So you talked a little bit about some things that Colorado is putting in place that are hopefully working to smooth this pipeline. What are some areas that you would hope to improve on, some priorities to improve this even more?
Okay. Importantly, we need to have common assessments at all institutions so we know whether students are doing well. Tied to that is a longitudinal data system that allows us to track every student from every school as that student progresses and moves from school to school, moves from the K-12 system to the higher ed system, and even moves into the workforce. We need that good data to make good policy decisions. Then we also need to follow through on the implementation of the Common Core in the K-12 system. If all students are taking the Common Core, then we'll know whether students are prepared to move into college successfully. And finally, we need to change our remediation, the way we remediate students who are not college ready when they graduate, because they are languishing in remedial courses and not ever moving on to college level courses, and certainly not moving towards a degree. So we've got to do all of those things if we want to see students move in a timely way through the system and out the other side with a valuable credential that allows them to find employment.
Great, thank you. Switching gears a little bit, your role as both Lieutenant Governor and the Executive Director of the Department of Higher Education here in Colorado is unusual. How does that impact education policy in your state?
Well, I think in a lot of ways. And I'll tell you first, I think it's important that I actually have a background in education before I went to the Department of Higher Ed. And so having run both a community college and a university, I have a better sense of how state policies and legislation actually impacts the administrator and the faculty member and the student at the institution. So I think it gives me a better sense of whether a particular piece of legislation is going to be helpful to an institution and a student, or whether it's going to create more red tape and more barriers. I think it's also helpful, though, because I work directly with the department, the institutions, and the legislature, so that we're able to bring people together to talk through policy. And then finally, we engage legislators as advisory members on our Colorado Commission on Higher Ed and on all of our task forces, so we're able to get legislative input. So when we come up with an idea that everybody agrees on, we've got a legislator who's there ready to carry it and be the champion through the legislature.
Great, thank you. And that leads me right to my next question of if you could just expand more on the role of the legislature in these policies we've talked about. How have you worked with lawmakers to strengthen these connections in the education pipeline?
Well, I would suggest to legislators that they get more involved in their education system, whether they're K-12 advocates or higher ed. They need to get involved and talk to educators about what their challenges are. I think they also need to try to serve on committees with the Department of Higher Ed, with the Department of Education, or with school districts, where they really get to see what are the challenges, what are the challenges that institution, that district is facing, and be a part of shaping a solution. I think also they need to think about what they can do through legislation to push institutions to do more, to kind of force them to work together and to align. Because the institutions have existed separately, K-12 has never been too concerned about what higher ed admission requirements are, and higher ed's never been too concerned about what K-12 graduation requirements are, and yet those things should be matched up. They should really mirror each other. So we need to force that. And then finally, I think we need to make sure that as students earn credits at one institution, let's say a community college, that student knows whether those credits will transfer. And sometimes without a legislative push, that simply isn't going to happen.
Thank you again. And just lastly, if there's anything else that you think would be important to share with legislators, legislative staff on the work that's happening in Colorado, and if they want to be improving their systems as you have been working on.
I would urge legislators to look at higher ed and K-12 through a different lens. We all tend to look at those institutions through the lens of our own experiences. We want college for our kids to be just like it was for us. But we're in a very changing environment right now. And we also need to recognize that the changing demographics in the K-12 system. We have more low-income and English language learners and students of color in our systems really everywhere in the country. And we need to devise systems that work for those first-generation and low-income students. We know that we need them to get through high school and get a post-secondary credential. In the old days, there were plenty of jobs for people who didn't have that. Now there's not. We need all of our students to have that opportunity to be prepared when they leave high school to compete at the highest levels, both in the post-secondary and then in the employment environments.
Well, great. Thank you so much for your time again, Lieutenant Governor. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.